Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. So today is the first Sunday of Lent, and I'm going to do a reading from Luke's Gospel, which talks about Jesus' final preparation for his public ministry, where he spends 40 days in the desert. And there's a very interesting difference between Matthew's account and Luke's account. According to Matthew, Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and fasted, and then he was hungry at the end of it, and then Satan tempted him at the low moment, as his weakest point. Luke's Gospel says he went into the desert for 40 days fasting, and Satan tempted him throughout the 40 days, so it was an ongoing. But they both agree that at the end of this temptation, Satan withdrew until a more opportune opportunity. And he comes right back at then the weakest moment in Christ's life, when he has this panic attack to end all panic attacks in the Garden of Gethsemane 24 hours before he dies, where he's so trembling with such anxiety that he's literally sweating blood. So Satan always waits for the most opportune occasion to come through. So here's Luke's version of it. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them, he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high mountain and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to them, "I will give you all authority and splendor, because it has been given to me, and I can give it to anybody I want to. If you worship me, all this will be yours." Jesus answered, "It is also written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The devil then led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here, because it is written, he will give his angels command concerning you to guard you very carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you do not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until a more opportune time. Words inspired by God. Life used to be much simpler, but maybe a lot more crude. There used to be far fewer professions, but they weren't half as sophisticated. So, for instance, up to a few hundred years ago, surgery was done by the local barber. Literally, the guy with the knife, he was in charge of all the surgeries. Only slowly by slowly did we break off and create, surgeons as distinct from barbers. And then surgery divides into we have cardiac surgeons and neurosurgeons and skeletal surgeons and intestinal surgeons, all different kinds of surgeons. The same thing was true of psychology. Up to very, very recently, the late 1800s, psychology was just a part of philosophy. When you studied philosophy, you studied ontology, which was the study of reality as it really is, and you studied epistemology, which is how we know what we know, and you studied psychology, human beings and their consciousness. So it was just part of psychology. And then in the 1890s, a great German scientist, a guy called Wilhelm Wundt, created psychology as a different discipline, experimental psychology. And very, very quickly, it fractured into, psychoanalysis under Freud and Jung, and then you had behaviorism under Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, and then you had humanistic psychology in the 1950s with, a whole bunch of people in California, and then you had transpersonal psychology in the 60s, and now you have CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and you've got EFT, emotional therapy, and you have all these different ways of doing psychology. And so it fractures a lot. But in all of this experimentation that psychology now goes on with, my favorite experiments come from social psychology. And I'm thinking particularly of an experiment I came across a few years ago. And it was an effort by a social psychologist to find out, how little children can defer pleasure. What will allow them to defer pleasure? So he set up this experiment. And basically, he's dealing with little kids between like 2 and 4. And he's taking them one at a time. But he's got hundreds of kids involved in this experiment. And typically, he'll take a child into a room, and there's a little chair, and there's a little table, and everything is very, very nice. And there's this gorgeous cookie with icing on it on the table. And the psychologist says to him, look, that cookie is for you. But I'm going to have to leave for a few minutes, and I'll be right back. And if you don't eat that cookie until I come back, I give you 2 cookies. But if you eat that one, that's all you get. And then he withdraws, and there's a one-way mirror. He's watching what the child is doing. So there's a little kid sitting down, 3-year-old child, watching this cookie, and he's salivating at the mouth. And he's looking around to see is there anybody watching. And depending on the child, you see a whole bunch of different reactions. One little kid would just reach out and touch it. Another little kid would look around and take a quick lick and put it back down and look around. Another kid will take a small little nibble and turn it around so you can't see the hole. And some really cute kid will turn it upside down and poke out a bit and put it in his mouth and put it back down. And depending, on sections, some kids, they just can't resist it, and so they eat it. And when the psychologists come back, they blame the dog. There is no dog. Or their big brother. There was no big brother. But somebody else ate it, I didn't eat it. But what you see is that there seem to be 3 factors at work there. The first one is the age of the child. Obviously, a 2-year-old has less ability to self-control than a 4-year-old. And the second thing has to do with how long the experiment is out of the room. How long can you resist? And the third one is, how good looking is the cookie? So there's a whole bunch of different factors. And so it's interesting to me watch how we defer pleasure or how we resist temptations of various kinds and what's the purpose of temptation. And so it never made any sense to me that little children don't reach the use of reason until about age 7. Before that, a child is neither immoral or moral. They're simply amoral. They can't make moral choices because they can't put themselves in other people's shoes, or they can't envisage a future scenario. They're just in the now. So to blame a 4-year-old child for eating the cookie doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so it never made sense to me that God threw Adam and Eve out of the garden for eating from the apple. Because before they ate the apple, they were irrational, they were pre-rational beings. The apple they ate was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So before they ate it, they couldn't distinguish between what is good and what is evil. Didn't make any sense. So for God to really get bent out of shape and kick him out of the garden for doing something that any little 2-year-old child would do, God puts literally cookies on the table and says, I'll be back. Don't touch the cookie. He wasn't even promising cookies when he came back. He said, don't eat the cookie. There are carrots over there, and there's broccoli over there. Eat the broccoli and eat the carrots, but don't eat the cookie. And of course, they ate the cookie. And only then could they distinguish between right and wrong, but God kicked them out anyway. So it didn't make any sense to me. God was a very dysfunctional parent to begin with. So I want to talk about that today. The reading today has to do with the temptation of Jesus Christ. So we're going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Satan the tempter. And then I'm going to, through this event, and I look at the 3 great temptations offered Jesus. The first temptation was a temptation to food. The second temptation was a temptation to power. And the third temptation was a temptation to religion. So they're the 4 points that I'll make this morning. So Satan the tempter. Possibly the greatest gift we possess as human beings. It's a toss-up for me between free will and imagination. I think these are the 2 greatest gifts we have as human beings, free will and imagination. But let's focus on free will. This extraordinary ability that's given to human beings of free will. And free will means, to do as I please. I can choose to do whatever I want. Now, free will is a moot issue if there aren't choices available to me. I don't really have free will if I don't have choices, if there aren't the possibility of eating the cookie now or eating the cooking later. There has to be choices available, otherwise free will is meaningless. And so free will means that I get a whole array of possibilities among which I have to make choices. Now, you ally to that then that we're all born as little infants, totally dedicated to service to self. We would not survive infancy if we weren't totally narcissists. We have to be totally focused on getting air into our lungs, getting food into our systems, getting warmth, getting cuddled by mommy and by daddy. So we're totally these needy creatures. We are totally fixated on the self. So everything is service to the self, and that's appropriate. But as we begin to move through age, we have to move along that spectrum from service to self to service to others. And I think that the midpoint in that, between 49% service to self and 51% service to others, happens around the age 12, theoretically at least. Because at age 7 we're rational beings, but only around age 12 or 13 do we become self-reflective beings. We can critique our own performance, and we can critique the performance of our community and our culture. And that's when we're invited to move beyond service to self into service to other. But many of us never get to that position whatsoever. We never reach even the 50% mark. For most of us, we spend our lifetimes in the service to self level. Sometimes 90% service to self and maybe 10% service to other. So that's how, in some senses, the notion of evil emerges. Evil is not a pre-existing condition. God did not give us a choice between good and bad. God gave us, free will, and He gave us the realization that we have to move from service to self as little infants into service for others as we age. But when we make choices continually for service to self, the energy that's created I now call evil. So evil is not a pre-existing reality, it's an emergent reality coming from the choices that we make for service to self. So if we keep making choices in the service to self, finally evil gets greater and greater and greater. And then it contaminates our relationships, interpersonally, intercommunally, and even internationally. And that's what I think original sin means. It's not that, Adam and Eve sinned, or that, our parents in their concupiscence conceived us in a moment when they were most unlike God. It's not about that. It's the realization that we create an energy on our planet, an energy of selfishness or service to self, which gets magnified until finally our children are born into a world where that's what they're told to do. That's what they're trained to do, to look out for number one. And if I would think of who is Satan then, Satan could well just be the personification of that, energy, or the aggregation of that energy, the aggregation of the energy of service to self. And we personify this and we call it Satan. Or maybe actually energy itself aggregates and has an ability to impact the human species. So then where does temptation come in this equation? Temptation is not a pass or fail grading. It's not either you pass it or you fail it. Temptation is an invitation to grow. It's the invitation to exercise discernment, to be able to figure out, should I eat the cookie now or eat the cookie later? So it's not about passing or failing a test. God is not testing us. He's not going to give us a fail grade or a pass grade, if we do A or do B. He's just giving us tools in which we grow into the realization and the self-awareness that it is by service to others, in our interpersonal relationships, in our intercommunal relationships, and into our international relationships. That's how growth happens. And then we move from free will into freedom. There's a huge difference. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. So the only truly free person is the person who's choosing to do the good. The only truly free person is the person who's choosing the service to others. I'm not saying you have to neglect yourself, but primarily it's about seeing the God in others and responding to the God in others. So it's a movement from free will to freedom. It's the movement from narcissism to compassion. It's the movement from being asleep to being fully awake. And so for me, that in some sense is what Satan means to me, and that's what temptation means for me. So that's my first point. My second point then, I'm going to go through these three temptations of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to map it onto a Hindu model. Hinduism has a beautiful teaching about this notion. So Hinduism teaches that there are four great movements throughout our incarnations, our various incarnations. They say firstly we have hundreds of lifetimes perhaps in which we're identified and attracted and fascinated by sensuality, whether that has to do with food or sex or wine or addictions of various kinds. And Hinduism says there's nothing wrong with that. Sensuality is no problem, as long as it's exercised with moral thinking. But that's only a first stage. A second stage comes, and we outgrow mere sensuality. Not that we abandon it. We'll always need, to listen to our senses, to feed ourselves, to be attracted, to have fun. But there's a second stage in which we think there must be something beyond mere sensuality. And we realize that there is. It's called power. So there's the attachment to power. For another few hundred incarnations, I'm now attracted to power, privilege, and prestige. And at some stage, I'm going to outgrow that and realize there must be something even beyond power. And there is. It's stage 3, according to Hinduism. And it is a service, being of service, compassionate service to others. But Hinduism says that is not the final stage, because that's predicated on the notion I can only be of service to Rita if I regard Rita as somebody different from me. And she's not. Rita is an expression of God, as I'm an expression of God. I'm one finger on the hand, Rita is another finger on the hand. When the hand reaches out to take food and puts it to the mouth, the hand is not giving up the food, and the mouth is not claiming the food. The mouth is going to digest it, and the energy created is going to benefit the hand. Every part of the body is going to benefit from what the mouth does with the food. And the hand is simply a stage in providing the food to the mouth, which provides it to the body. So we're all feeding ourselves. So Hinduism realizes then that even service is only the penultimate stage. The final stage is what they call moksha, total liberation, the realization that there is only God, that everything that exists is God in drag. Everything is an emanation from source. And so there are the 4 great movements, in Hinduism over lifetimes. Now I'm going to map that onto the temptations of Jesus this morning. Because in the first temptation, the story is Jesus is in the desert, he's been fasting for 40 days, he's really, really hungry, and at the end of it, Satan comes along at the weak point, and he's going to test him at his weakest point. And he says, okay, more or less, you've been preparing for the last 30 years because you think you're special. You think you're a son of God. I know for the last 40 days you've been really, really kind of honing it. You're ready now to do your shtick. You're going to go out there, you're going to be a preacher, and you're going to be a healer. You think you're something special. You think you're really the son of God? Okay. Prove it to yourself and prove it to me. See that stone there? Make a loaf of bread out of it. Feed yourself. Now again, Hinduism warns us. They call these the siddhis. As you evolve according to Hinduism, you develop a whole bunch of psychic abilities. But a lot of people get attracted and distracted by the psychic abilities, and they forget the journey. So here's the temptation now for Christ, to turn this into a loaf of bread. It wouldn't be the first time it was done. 1,200 years before him, Moses spent 40 years creating bread for the Israelites in the desert. Every single morning they woke up and there was manna on the ground, flour, and they baked bread out of it. And so Jesus he's saying to Jesus, okay, big boy, you think you're as good as Moses? You think you're a special son of God? Moses fed, a whole group of people, 2 million people for 40 years with bread in the middle of the desert. Create a loaf of bread for me. Let's see how good you are. Now, it wasn't just that Satan was saying to him, okay, you're hungry, you need food, make bread out of the stone. What he was really saying is, look, you could turn all the stones in all the deserts of the world into food. You could end world poverty with just the flick of a thumb. Go for it. It was a huge temptation. Not just that Jesus wanted to feed his own hunger, but that he could end world hunger instantaneously. And it's possible that he could. So why didn't he? Because Christ realized that all that would happen was the bread would be confiscated. The oligarchy, the 1%, would hoard the bread and they'd give it out, to people in order to do their bidding. And it would be weaponized. And that's precisely what happened before. It happened with the agricultural revolution 5,000 years ago, when for the first time ever, we were able to mass produce food and store it so that it didn't get spoiled or eaten by rodents. And what happened? We weaponized it. The great empires arose and they confiscated the food and they dished it out to those who were loyal and they burned the food supplies of those who were against them. We're doing it in our own time. Monsanto is doing it. The European Union has butter mountains and milk lakes that they're hoarding so as to drive up the prices. We pay farmers in the first world to not grow crops in order to keep the prices inflated. There's more than enough food in the world today to feed everybody in the world today. But there isn't either the economic models or the political will to do it. because food is a weapon of control. And Christ realized that. If I turned every single stone in every desert of the world into food, I wouldn't be ending world hunger. I'd just be creating more resources for the oligarchy to control people. So he says, no, I'll pass. I'll pass on this one. So it's about, the invitation there is about us creating different economic models. It's about us creating different political systems that make food and housing and education and healthcare the right of every single human being on the planet. Not for just a little oligarchy to control our destinies. Christ could see that as plain as the nose on your face. He was following in the steps of the Buddha. 500 years before him, the Buddha was offered the very same temptation by Mara. As he was sitting under his Bodhi tree, Mara, the temptress, came and said to him, why don't you turn this mountain into gold? And the idea was then you could give gold to everybody in the world and you could end world poverty. And the Buddha's response was, if I turned every mountain in the world into gold, there wouldn't be enough gold to satisfy one person's greed. So it's not about making stuff available. It's about how you make it available really to people who need it, not just those who want it. So that was the first temptation of Christ. It wasn't just about him deciding not to make bread to satisfy his own hunger. It was resisting the temptation just to create bread, which would go into the coffers of the oligarchy in order to allow them to control us even more effectively. He says, no, I'll pass on that one. The second temptation then, Satan takes him up to the top of a high mountain. And obviously there's no mountain in Israel high enough. Even Mount Everest at 29,029 feet isn't big enough. So imagine a situation where actually Satan lifts him off planet. And he gives the globe a whack, and it spins around. And he shows him all the empires of the world throughout human history. You can see the great empires of China, the empires of Mongolia, the empires of Persia and Babylon and Acadia, the empires of Egypt and Greece and Rome and Portugal and Spain and Britain and the United States of America. He spins the globe and he shows him all of these empires. And he says, all that's mine. I control all of that. And I can give it to anybody I want. So I'll give it to you if you will just worship me. Now, he wasn't actually saying, I want you to bend the knee and say, Satan, I worship you. Satan, I worship you. What he's saying is, I want you to work according to my principles, the ways in which I do it. I give you charge of all of this. Now, Christ obviously wasn't into personal power, so and Satan knew that. It wasn't that Jesus, I'd love to be the king of the universe. Wow, let's go for it. It's much more subtle. What Satan is saying is, realize you'll have charge of all of the institutions. You'll be in charge of all the armies. You'll be in charge of the economic systems. You'll be in charge of the political processes. So you can create any kinds of laws you want, and you can create a world based on compassion, because you'll have the reins of everybody. And all you need to do is do it the way I want you to do it. Now, although Christ wasn't into personal power, this must have been a real temptation. If you could change the world right now, any of us right here, if you were given the reins where you could control our economic system, our political process, our education, our medicine, our agriculture, our legal systems, and you being the compassionate person you are, you had control of all those, would you be effective? Within a year, there'd be a coup d'etat. Somebody down the line who wanted power would overthrow you, and your compassionate system would fall asunder. Because it's not so much, it's about personal evolution. I did a funeral up in Healdsburg yesterday for a friend of mine, a man who died of a heart attack a few weeks ago. And part of what happened was they sent me a bunch of his writings. He was an extraordinary character. I would call him a mystic, although he was an architect by profession. And I went through his writings, and he's quoting all these great avatars throughout human history. And there's one particular phrase that he latched onto from the poet Rumi. And Rumi says, yesterday I was clever. I tried to change the world. Today I'm wise. I'm trying to change myself. Yeah. So there's a huge difference, between cleverness or knowledge on the one hand and wisdom on the other hand. Knowledge is just the information that's delivered by our sensorium and processed by our brain. Wisdom is information that's delivered from our heart and processed by the soul. They're very different. One just deals with the physical world, and the other deals both with the physical and the metaphysical. So in order to make a change in the world, you have to change both the structures and the people. Christ will put this very powerfully when he says, new wine needs new wineskins. What does new wine mean? New wine means transformed individuals. New wineskins, what does that mean? Transformed institutions. If you have one without the other, the corrupt one will corrupt the other one as well. If the people are good and the system is bad, the system will corrupt the people. If the people are bad and the system is good, the people will corrupt the system. And Christ knew that. So here's the kind of temptation. We'll give you charge of all these possibilities. You can drive it any way you want. And Christ realizes you can't impose morality on people. You can entice people. You can inspire people to make changes. And we certainly have the need to change our systems. But if our systems are changed through violence, we become violent people. And then we corrupt the new systems with our own violence. So it becomes really, really important, that yesterday I was clever, I tried to change the world. Today I'm wise, I'm trying to change myself. It's by changing ourselves that we're going to create communities, transform communities, which then can create systems which are staffed by people who are themselves transformed. So for the second time, Christ says, no, I'll give a pass on that one too. And then finally, Satan takes him to the parapet of the temple in Jerusalem. And in the middle of a feast, obviously, and there are Jews from all over the world, from the diaspora, gathered for some big festival, and a whole bunch of Gentiles as well for the occasion. And Satan says to him, here's the scoop. I want you to throw yourself down. Shout down first. You all down there. Hi. People are looking at him and say, oh my God, is this guy going to commit suicide? And then I want you to jump without a bungee cord. And it says, according to Psalm 91, he will give his angels command over you, lest you dash your foot against a stone. Imagine what will happen. People are watching, oh my God, he's jumping. And you land and you float down and you say, guys, I've come to start a brand new religion. I'm going to call it Christianity. And I want all you guys to follow me. It's going to be the answer to all the world's ills. So this is the great final temptation, a temptation to religion. And Christ realized you can't do that. Christ was not the first Christian. He didn't come to set up a new religion. He came to kind of fan alive the flames of mystical thinking that would then permeate all of the existing systems. But setting up a new religion, when you study world history, you see the same cycle happen again and again and again. Whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Zoroastrianism or Buddhism or Hinduism, they all go through the same cycle. It starts off with some extraordinary charismatic prophet, a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure or a Krishna figure, who has a deep mystical impulse. And because of his charism, a community gathers around because they like what he's saying. So stage 3 is there's a community formed. Stage 4 is the prophet dies, or more frequently is killed because it's too dangerous to the establishment. And then the community morphs into an organization. And then the organization is taken over by a self-appointed oligarchy. And the oligarchy creates orthodoxy and dogma. You have to believe this and you have to do that in order to be a member of our group. And then that leads to inquisitions, people who aren't keeping the rules according to the orthodoxy. And then so you have inquisitions and you kill your own. And then you have crusades, if you have power, and you kill those who don't believe what you tell them is the truth. And then at some stage, some new prophet comes along, maybe like in the 1200s, Francis of Assisi, who challenges the Roman Catholic Church and its excesses. And it goes through the same system. What Francis set up in its own time became totally corrupted. The Franciscans were the prime movers in the Inquisition. And so this extraordinary character in the 1200s, who preached love for animals, donkeys and stars and mountaintops, are now killing people and dismembering them, members of his own community that he founded. So that becomes a cycle again. So the answer to world problems is not a new religion. It's maybe communities who are alive and communities who are interacting and networking with each other. But we desperately do not need a new religion, a new guru who's going to start up with a new system that's going to save us from ourselves. And Jesus knew that. He knew that this is the cycle that happens again and again. And so for the third time, Jesus says, no, I'll pass on that one. I'm not interested in setting up a new religion. So what then is the story? The story that started with free will, and service to self or service to others, that from which emerged evil and the notion of Satan. What is the story about it? Free will is very important. Without free will, we'd simply be robots, artificially pre-programmed robots who can only respond to life in a particular fashion. And so I see there are four kind of aspects to it. There are people who are unconsciously good. They're not good because they're awake, they just happen to be doing stuff that's nice. And I just call those people lucky. And there are people who are unconsciously evil. They're not trying to be bad, they're just doing it. And I call those people asleep. And then there are people who are consciously doing evil stuff in order to gain control. And I call those pathological. And then there are people who are consciously trying to do good. And I call those people enlightened. And that's the journey of temptation. Temptation is not a kind of a pass or fail grading, as I say. It is not that God is testing us to see if we're worthy of the kingdom. It is the way in which we grow. I'm convinced, in fact, that in some senses, temptation is the royal road to enlightenment. It is only by encountering situations in which we have to make constant choices between service to self or service to others, that through meeting those circumstances, you can call them temptation if you want, that's how we grow in awareness. That's how we become enlightened beings. That's how we go from unconscious living to conscious living, and from service to self to service to others, from narcissism to compassion, and from free will to freedom. We end with a great story from the Talmud, a compendium of Jewish stories. There's a story told that one evening after they'd been thrown out of the garden, Adam and Eve decided to try to sneak back in there because they really liked the fruit of this tree. So in the middle of the night, they sneak back in and they go up to the tree and they're just about to pluck the fruit and they hear some rustling in the leaves. And they look around and there's God eating one of the apples and he's caught in the act. Even God is tempted. Even God needs to grow.